I thought we could just go through some of the stuff that will show up in the selection editor over here, because that's where I spend like 90% of my time in Figma. So let's say that we're working on an app design. So I'll create a new frame up here. We'll go and choose a phone. We'll choose the 15 Pro. Okay, awesome. So let's imagine this is a mobile phone. And I want to have a card in some user interface, a card like this. And so I draw a rectangle, and now I go in here to change all the properties to make this rectangle look really good. And so let me just show you the kinds of properties that I'm typically playing with here. So first of all, we have the size or the dimensions up here. So I just try to clean up these values quite nicely. So it's not like 21.5, that's a disgusting value. You want them to be like nice rounded values. Typically divisible by 4 is nice because it's just very useful. So 20 is divisible by 4, quite nice. And then I try to set these values to something nice as well. Apple often have weird sizes for the screen, so I'm actually just going to clean this up and say that it's like 400 times 800 for the sake of our sanity. And so we can clean this value up and say that it's 360 pixels wide, plus 20, plus 20. On the sides here, that's going to make 400 in total. So nice, clean math. This should be something like 240 just to make me sleep good at night. So you want nice, clean values here. And then we can add a little radius here. And so again, like divisible by 4 is quite nice. Just something that feels, I don't know, that makes sense. Like you don't want a radius of 17. That's just weird. So I try to pick like 20 or maybe 24 even. Alrighty. Then we have the constraints panel. And the constraints panel allows us to say, to define how this scales if the screen screen size should change. So for this card, we can just say that, and I'm going to hold down Shift now to make sort of a multi-selection. So I'm going to say stick to the left and stick to the right. Okay, perfect. And now when I change the size of the screen, this card is going to adapt here. And then we have the opacity of the layer. I want that to be 100%, but we could go down and make it less opaque if we wanted to, or more opaque. I never learn exactly which one is which. And we also have blend modes, which can be useful in some situations. But then we get down to the fill property, and this is where things get fun. So I want these cards to have a color, and I can choose some nice color here. Maybe a blue card could be kind of nice. And you can also create a gradient. You can choose 2 colors, like something like that looks kind of nice. And you can also sort of adjust the gradient, like the different stops of the gradient. So maybe you want to have a little shine effect at the bottom here. And it's going to look terrible, but yeah, that's how you create gradients here in Figma. But I'm quite content with just having a single color here. So let's put a color like that. Or actually, to make this look good, let's make this white, and we click the frame and make that a little bit more subdued instead. Okay, so back to this card. That was the background. And you can add multiple backgrounds, which is kind of fun. So you can, this gets stacked on top of each other. So you can say like, oh, I want a red background, but 20% opacity to be added on top of this white background. And so typically this is nice for things like you're adding a background image. So let's take this surfer guy. So that's the background image, but then you want to fade it out, and then you can put a color on top of it, like maybe 75%. And that's quite nice. So you can use the multiple background feature to sort of blend different layers together and just still be on that single rectangle, but like the background consists of all these things together, which is quite nice. And then you have the stroke property. So many things often have strokes. And so you can choose the width of the stroke, and you can choose where you want that stroke to sit. So by default, it's on the inside, which can be nice in some situations, but you also get these like square corners here. So visually speaking, sometimes outside is nicer because you get these nice rounded corners here. Or maybe you want it on the center. So like a little bit on the outside, a little bit on the outside or inside. So that's where the border sits. And of course, you can set a color for the border as well. You can even do a gradient for that border. So maybe you want to, like on the top, I want it to be white because that looks a little shiny, but on the bottom, I want it to be dark. And so this can create a little bit of like a gradient 3D effect, but only on the border. But that can be kind of cool. You can change the direct angle of this, so maybe like it goes from the top right to the bottom left. And also like a little bit of 3D effect, something like that. And so those are the properties for borders. And just like background images, you can add multiple strokes. So maybe you can add like a little bit of red, or it's actually not multiple strokes, it's multiple fills for the same stroke. But so we have the linear fill here for the stroke, but you can maybe add a little bit of red and blend that into that gradient that we had. So yeah, you can just play around with these values and mix different fills together to create a single stroke. By default, the stroke is applied equally on all sides, but you can press this guy and choose that, like, actually I want to go in and like have not much of a stroke on the top, a big stroke on the bottom, some stroke on the right. You can get kind of trippy with this. Typically I don't do this, but you could. But actually this looks so terrible, it hurts my eyes, so I'm just gonna go ahead and remove it altogether. And finally, when we've added a fill, we have added a stroke, we can add an effect. And the effects panel has 4 different things you can do. You can add an inner shadow, which is added to the inside of the rectangle. And so I quite often use that to create kind of a glow effect. So we say that, like, give us a little bit of a shine here at the top. And so maybe a 1 pixel white line like that. Okay, so that gives us a kind of a nice 3D effect, especially if I tone it down just a little bit. And then we can add another effect. So we can have multiple effects here. And so this time I add a drop shadow just below the card here. That makes it look a little bit like it's floating, which is quite nice. And we can add a third effect, which is the layer blur. And that's sort of the thing that just takes the entire layer and adds a blur to it, which is cool if maybe you're designing like a modal and you want the background to be blurred. You can just group all the elements in the background and add a layer blur, and now they get blurred out, which is quite neat. And the fourth layer effect you can add is the background blur. So let's say that we sort of, you click something and you want to show a little modal or a little alert. That's when we use the background blur. And so you can click that and you can change the properties here. You can choose how much you want the background to be blurred. Now you'll notice that you're not seeing anything because we have a fill that is 100% here. So we actually have to go in here and reduce the opacity of that fill. And now you can see that background blur coming through. So maybe something like that. And maybe we add a little radius to this. And so this is like a little alert that popped up. And so that's quite nice. We can increase the opacity a little bit, tweak the background blur so it's just a little bit opaque. This is very Apple to like play around with these things and trying to create a nice combination of different blurs and opacities. And maybe we want to create a little depth effect as well, so we can go back to the card in the background and add a layer blur to that, like that, which this also blurs further. So like you can play around with these blur effects, both the background blur and the layer blur, to create these interesting depth effects. And finally, you have the export panel down here. This is where you export assets. So you can choose, do you want it to be the native resolution, which is the width and the height up here? Or do you want to maybe do like a retina export where you'd like 2x that? You can add a suffix to the file name as well. So like at 2x. And now you can export that. And what's nice about that is that they are remembered the next time you come into Figma. So if you set up an export setting here, it will be remembered and you can just export it again. And so one thing that is nice to fix is that if you have, like, let's say that you're designing icons, before you start copying them to create more icons, you can just fix the export settings first. So like you can set, okay, I want to download a 1x and I want to download a 2x and I want to download a 3x as an SVG. And so now when you copy this and create more icons, all of them are going to have that same export setting, which means that if I go down and like, okay, I want to export this, all those settings will be prepared here and I can just press export. And now I'm going to get a zip file with all those resolutions in it, which is quite nice. So yeah, that's the export panel. And that's all the things that I play around with here, essentially. This what we saw here was the settings that are available for rectangles. If you go to text, you're going to have some different settings like font size, line height, character spacing, paragraph spacing, behavior of the text box. Does it overflow? Does it not overflow? Stuff like that. This like intrinsic width, automatic height, automatic width and height. Stuff like that. So you can play around with these properties. So different types of things will have different properties. But typically, like everything, including text, has fill, stroke, effects, and export. So if you know these guys, you're going to get very far in Figma.